Chapter 17 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. On the flood tide. French was astir betimes next morning, and over his coffee and rolls and honey, he laid his plans for the day. As to the next step of his investigation, he had no doubt. He must begin by finding out what vessels had left the city after 2 p.m. on the previous Thursday. That done, he could go into the question of the passengers each carried, in the hope of learning that Dangle was among them. At the outset, he was faced by the handicap of being a stranger in a strange land. If Antwerp had been an English port, he would have known just where to get his information, but here he was unfamiliar with the ropes. He did not know if all sailings were published in any paper or available to the public at any office. Moreover, his ignorance of both French and Flemish precluded his mixing with clerks or dock loafers from whom he might pick up information. Of course, there were the Belgian police, but he did not wish to apply to them if he could carry out his job by himself. However, this part of his problem proved easier of solution than he had expected. Inquiries at the post office revealed the fact that there was a shipping agency in the Rue des Tanneurs, and soon he had reached the place, found a clerk who spoke English, and put his question. When French wished to be suave, as he usually did, he could, so to speak, have wheedled his best bone from a bulldog. Now, explaining in a friendly and confidential manner who he was and why he wanted the information, he begged the other's good offices. The clerk, flattered at being thus courteously approached, showed a willingness to assist, with the result that in 10 minutes French had the particulars he needed. He turned into a cafe, and calling for a bock, sat down to consider what he had learned. And of this, the very first fact filled him with delight, as it seemed to fit in with the theory he had evolved. On Thursday, it had been high water at 2:30 p.m. By 2:30, the dock gates had been opened, and it appeared that, taking advantage of this, several steamers had left shortly after that hour. This was distinctly encouraging, and French turned to the list of ships with a growing hope that the end of his investigation might be coming into sight. In all, 11 steamers had left the port on the day in question, between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m., the period he had included in his inquiry. There was, first of all, a Canadian Pacific liner, which had sailed from the Keys at 3 p.m., and at 3:30, a small passenger boat had left for Oslo and Bergen. The remaining boats were tramps. There were 4 coasters, 2 for Newcastle, 1 for Goole, and 1 for Belfast, a 6,000-tonner for Singapore and the Dutch islands, another slightly smaller ship for Genoa and Spezia, and another for Boston, USA. Then there was a big 5-masted sailing ship, bound with a general cargo for Buenos Aires and the River Plate. And finally, there was a small freighter in ballast for Casablanca. Of these 11 ships, the Windjammer at once attracted French's attention. Here was a vessel on which, if you took a passage, you might easily require 3 dozen tins of peaches before you reached your journey's end. He determined to begin with this, taking the other ships in order according to the position of their offices. Fortunately, in each case, the clerk had given him the name of the owners or agents. His first call, therefore, was at an old-fashioned office in a small street close to the Steen Museum. There he saw Monsieur Leblanc, the owner of the Windjammer, and explained his business, but Monsieur Leblanc could not help him. The old gentleman had never heard of Dangle, nor had anyone resembling his visitor's photograph called or done any business with his firm. Moreover, no passengers had shipped on the Windjammer, and the crew that had sailed was unchanged since the previous voyage. This was not encouraging, and French went on to the next item on his program, the headquarters of the small freighter which had sailed in ballast for Casablanca. She was owned by Messrs. Merkel and Lowenthal, whose office was further down the Rue des Tanneurs, and 5 minutes later he had pushed open the door and was inquiring for the principal. This was a more modern establishment than that of M. Leblanc. Though small, the office ran to plate-glass windows, teak furniture, polished brass fittings, and encaustic tiles, while the two typists he could envisage through the small inquiry window seemed unduly gorgeous as to raiment and pert as to demeanor. He was kept waiting for some minutes, then told that M. Merkel, the head of the business, was away, but that M. Lowenthal, the junior partner, would see him. His first glance told French that M. Lowenthal was a man to be watched. Seldom had he seen so many of the telltale signs of roguery concentrated in the features of one person. The junior partner had a mean, sly look, close-set, shifty eyes which would not meet French's, and a large mouth with loose, fleshy lips. His manner was in accord with his appearance, now blustering, now almost fulsomely ingratiating. French took an instant dislike to him, and though he remained courteous as ever, he determined not to lay his cards on the table. "My name," he began, "as you will have seen from my card, is French, and I carry out the business of a general agent in London. I am trying to obtain an interview with a friend who has been staying here off and on for some time. I came on here from Brussels in the hope of seeing him, but he had just left. I was told that he had sailed with your ship, the Lescaut, on Thursday afternoon, and if so, I called to ask at which port I should be likely to get in touch with him. His name is Dangle." While French spoke, he watched the other narrowly, on his favorite theory that the involuntary replies to unexpected remarks, starts, changes of expression, sudden pallors, were more valuable than spoken answers. But M. Lowenthal betrayed no emotion other than a mild surprise. "That is a very extraordinary statement, sir," he said in heavy, guttural tones. "I do not really know who could have given you such misleading information. Your friend's name is quite unknown to me, and in any case we do not take passengers on our ships." This seemed an entirely reasonable and proper reply, and yet to French's highly developed instincts it did not ring true. However, he could do nothing more, and after a little further conversation containing not a few veiled inquiries, all of which he noted were skillfully parried by the other, he apologized for his mistake and withdrew. Though he was dissatisfied with the interview, he could only continue his program. He recognized that the secret might be located in Canada or the States, and that Dangle might have booked on the CPR liner, or he might have gone to Norway. Indeed, for the matter of that, he might have signed on any of the ships for any part of the world. But after a tedious morning of calls and interviews, French had to confess defeat. He could get no further. At none of the offices at which he applied had he obtained the slightest helpful hint. It began to look as if he had been mistaken as to Dangle's sea expedition, and if so, as he reminded himself with exasperation, he had no alternative theory to follow up. He strolled slowly along the pleasant, sunlit streets as he reviewed his morning's work. He was satisfied with all his interviews but the one. Everywhere save in M. Lowenthal's office he felt he had been told the truth, but instinctively he distrusted the junior partner. That the man had lied to him he had no reason to suspect, but he had no doubt that he would do so if it suited his book. French felt that it was unsatisfactory to leave the matter in this state, and he presently thought of a simple subterfuge whereby it might be cleared up. It was almost the lunch hour, a suitable time for putting his project into operation. He hurried back to the Rue des Tanneurs, and turning into a cafe nearly opposite Messrs. Merkel and Lowenthal's premises, ordered a bock and selected a seat from which he could observe the office door. He was only just in time. He had not taken his place 5 minutes when he saw Mr. Lowenthal emerge and walk off towards the center of the town. 3 men clerks and the 2 rapid-looking typists followed. And lastly, there appeared the person for whom he was waiting, the sharp-looking office boy who had attended to him earlier in the day. The boy turned off in the opposite direction to his principal, towards a quarter inhabited by laborers and artisans, and French, getting up from his table, slipped quietly out of the cafe and followed him. The chase continued for some 10 minutes, when the quarry disappeared into a small house in a back street. French strolled up and down until some half an hour later the young fellow reappeared. As he approached, French allowed a look of recognition and slight surprise to appear on his features. "Ah," he said, pausing with a friendly smile, "you are the clerk who attended to me this morning in Messrs. Merkel and Lowenthal's office, are you not? A piece of luck meeting you. I wonder if you could give me a piece of information. I forgot to ask it of Monsieur Lowenthal this morning, and as I am in a hurry, it would be worth 5 francs to me not to have to go back to your office." The youth's eyes had brightened at the suggestion of financial dealings, and French felt he would learn all the other could tell him. He therefore continued without waiting for a reply. "The thing is this. I am joining my friend, Monsieur Dangle, aboard the Lescaut at the first opportunity. It was arranged between us that one of us should take with him a couple of dozen of champagne. I want to know whether he took the stuff, or whether I am to. Can you help me at all?" The clerk's English, though fairly good, was not quite equal to such a strain, and French had to repeat himself less idiomatically. But the boy grasped his meaning at last, and then at once dashed his hopes by saying he had never heard of any Monsieur Dangle. "There he is," French went on, producing his photograph. "You must have seen him scores of times." And then French got the reward of his pertinacity. A look of recognition passed over the clerk's features, and he made a gesture of comprehension. "Mais oui, monsieur. Yes, sir," he answered quickly. "But that is not Monsieur Dangle. I know him. It is Monsieur Charles." "That's right," French returned, trying to keep the triumph out of his voice. "His name is Dangle Charles. I know him as Monsieur Dangle because he is one of 4 brothers at our works. But of course he would give his name here as Monsieur Charles. But now, can you tell me anything about the champagne?" The clerk shook his head. He had not known upon what business Monsieur Charles had called at the office. "Oh, well, it can't be helped," French declared. "I thought that perhaps when he was in with you last Wednesday, you might have heard something about it. You don't know what luggage he took aboard the Lescaut?" The clerk had not been aware that Monsieur Charles had embarked on the freighter. Still less did he know of what his luggage had consisted. But as French talked on in his pleasant way, the following facts became apparent. First, that Dangle for some weeks past had been an occasional visitor at the shipping office. Second, that on the previous Wednesday he had been closeted with the partners for the greater part of the day. Third, that the Lescaut had evidently sailed on an expedition of considerable importance and length, for a vast deal of stores had gone aboard her, about which both partners had shown very keen anxiety. Fourthly, that not only had Monsieur Merkel, the senior partner, himself sailed on her, but it was likely that he intended to be away some time, as Monsieur Lowenthal had moved into his room. And lastly, that the Lescaut had come up from the firm's yard during the Wednesday night and had anchored in the river off the Steen until she left about 3 p.m. on the Thursday. These admissions made it abundantly clear that French was once more on the right track, and he handed over his 5 francs with the feeling that he had made the cheapest bargain of his life. He had no doubt that Dangle had sailed with the senior partner on the tramp, but he felt he must make sure, and he walked slowly back towards the quays, turning over in his mind possible methods for settling the point. One inquiry seemed promising. If the ship had lain at anchor out in the river, and if Dangle had gone aboard her, he must have had a boat to do so. French wondered could he find that boat. He felt himself held up by the language difficulty. Up to the present, he had had extraordinary luck in this respect, but then up to the present, he had been interviewing educated persons whose business brought them in contact with foreigners. He doubted if he could make boatmen and loafers about the quays understand what he wanted. A trial convinced him that his fears were well-founded, and he lost a solid hour in finding the burgled school and engaging a young linguist with a reputation for discretion. Then, accompanied by Monsieur Jules Reynard, he returned to the quays and set systematically to work. He began by inquiring where boats might be hired and where there were steps at which ships' boats might come alongside. Taking these in turn, he asked had the boatman taken a passenger out to the Lescaut between 2 and 3 p.m. on the previous Thursday, or had the loafer, stevedore, shunter, or constable, as the case might be, noticed if a boat had come ashore from the same vessel on the same date and at the same time. Though the work was easy, it bade fair to be tedious, and therefore for more than one reason French felt a glow of satisfaction when at his fourth inquiry his question received an affirmative answer. A wizened old man, one of a small knot of longshoremen whom Monsieur Reynard addressed, separated himself from his companions and came forward. He said that he was a boatman, and that he had been hailed by a man, an Englishman, he believed, at the time stated, and had rowed him out to the ship. "Ask him if that's the man," French directed, producing Dangle's photograph, though he felt there could be no doubt as to the reply. He was therefore immensely dashed when the boatman shook his head. This was not the man at all. The traveller was a short, rather stout man with a small, fair mustache. French gasped. The description sounded familiar. Taking out Blessington's photograph, he passed it over. This time the boatman nodded. Yes, that was the man he had rowed out. He had no doubt of him whatever. This was unexpected, but most welcome news. Though as French thought over it, he saw that it was not so surprising after all. If Dangle was in it, why not Blessington? And for the matter of that, why not Syme also? In this case, he wondered where Susan could be, and more acutely, what had been the fate of Joan Merrill. Possibly, he thought, his inquiries about Dangle would solve these questions also. Half an hour later, he struck oil for the second time. Another boatman, a little further along the quays, had also rowed a passenger out to the Lescaut, and this one, it appeared, was Dangle. But though French kept working steadily away, he could hear nothing of Syme. In the end, it was a suggestion of Reynard's that put him once more on the trail. The interpreter proved an intelligent youth, and when he had grasped the point at issue, he stopped and pointed to the river. "You say, monsieur, the ship, she lie there, opposite the Musée Steen, is it not so? Bon, we have walked along all the quays near to that. Your friends would not have hired boat from further on. It is too far. You say, too, they come from England secretly, is it not? Bon, they would come to the other side." French did not understand. "The other side?" he repeated questioningly. "But yes, monsieur, the other side." The young fellow's eyes flashed in his eagerness. "Over there, la Gare de Wez." He pointed out across the great stream to its west bank. "I didn't know there was a station across there," French admitted. "Where does the line go to?" "Direct to Ghent. Your friends change trains at Ghent. It is a quiet railway. They come unseen." "Good man," said French heartily. "We'll go and find out. How do you get to the blessed place?" Monsieur Reynard smiled delightedly. "Ah, yes, monsieur. You wish to cross, is it not?" he cried. "This way. We take ferry from the Quai Van Dyck. It is near." Half an hour later, they had reached the Tête de Flandre, the low-lying western bank of the Scheldt. It bore a small but not unpicturesque cluster of old-fashioned houses, nestling about one of the historic Antwerp forts. Reynard, now apparently quite as interested in the chase as French, led the way along the riverbank from boatman to boatman, with the result that before very many minutes had passed, French had obtained the information he wanted. It appeared that about 1 p.m. on the day in question, a strapping young boatman had noticed 3 strangers approaching from the direction of the Wez station, 100 yards or more distant. They consisted of a tall, clean-shaven man of something under middle age, and 2 women, both young. One was tall and strongly made and dark as to hair and eyes. The other was slighter and with red gold hair. The smaller one seemed to be ill, and was stumbling along between the other 2, each of whom supported her by an arm. None of the trio could speak French or Flemish, but they managed by signs to convey the information that they wanted to be put on board the Lescaut, which was lying out in midstream. The man had rowed them out, and they had been received on board by an elderly gentleman with a dark beard. Further questions produced the information that the fair lady appeared to be seriously ill, though whether it was her mind or body that was affected, the boatman couldn't be sure. She was able to walk, but would not do so unless urged on by the others. She had not spoken or taken any interest in the journey. She had not appeared even to look round her, but had sat gazing listlessly at nothing, with a vacant expression in her eyes. Her companions had had real difficulty in getting her up the short ladder onto the Lescaut's deck. The news was rather unexpected to French. About Joan Merrill it was both disconcerting and reassuring. The former because he could not see that the gang had anything but a sinister reason for inveigling the young girl aboard the ship. Probably she will fall overboard at night, he thought. The latter because she was at least still alive, or had been 2 days ago. It was quite evident that she was drugged, probably with morphine or something similar. It might, however, mean that while wishing Joan no harm, they were taking her with them on their expedition to ensure her silence as to their movements. As French returned across the ferry, he kept on puzzling as to Lowenthal's position. Could Lowenthal be arrested? Was he in league with the gang? If so, could he be held responsible for the abduction of Joan Merrill? French didn't think the evidence would justify drastic measures. He had, as a matter of fact, no actual evidence against Lowenthal. Of his complicity he was satisfied, but he doubted if he could prove it. He got rid of the young interpreter, and strolling slowly along the quays, thought the matter out. No, he had not a good enough case with which to go to the Belgian police, but he could do the next best thing. He could call on Monsieur Lowenthal for the second time and try to bluff an admission out of him. As he walked to the Rue des Tanneurs, he felt his prospects were not rosy, but at least he had no difficulty in obtaining his interview. Monsieur Lowenthal seemed surprised to see him so soon again, but received him politely and asked what he could do for him. "I want to ask you another question, Monsieur Lowenthal, if you please," French answered in his pleasantest manner. "And first I must tell you that the agency I hold is that of Detective Inspector at New Scotland Yard, in London. My question is this. When you and Monsieur Merkel entered into relations with Blessington, Syme, and the Dangles, did you know that they were dangerous criminals, wanted by the English police?" In spite of the most evident efforts for self-control, Lowenthal was so much taken aback that he could not for some moments speak. His swarthy face turned a greenish hue, and little drops of sweat showed on his forehead. To the other pleasant characteristics with which French had mentally endowed him, he now added that of coward, and his hopes of his bluff succeeding grew brighter. He sat waiting in silence for the other to recover himself, then said suavely, "After that, Monsieur Lowenthal, you will see for yourself that you cannot plead ignorance of the affair. Let me advise you for your own sake to be open with me." The man pulled himself together. He wiped his brow as he replied earnestly, but in somewhat shaky accents. "That I have met Blessington, Syme, and Dangle, I do not deny, though they are Merkel's friends, not mine. But I do not know that they are criminal. Dangle, he called here and asked Merkel to take him on the next," he hesitated for a word, "next work, next sail of the ship. Merkel said that Dangle is a writer. He writes books. He wished to see the sail to Casablanca, to describe it in his book. Merkel said he would have to pay fare. The firm could not afford it unless. Dangle agreed. Merkel was going himself, and Dangle suggested Syme and Blessington go also, to make party, to play cards. Of a second dangle I know nothing. They went secretly, I admit it, because the law forbids to take passengers for sale without a certificate. That is all of the affair." Not a single word of this statement did French believe, but he saw that unless he could get some further information, or surprise this Lowenthal into some more damaging admission, he could not have him arrested. After all, the story hung together. Merkel might conceivably be playing his own game, and have pitched the yarn of the author out for copy to his partner. The contravention of the shipping laws would undoubtedly account for the secrecy with which the start was made. Certainly there was no evidence to bring before a jury. French proceeded to question the junior partner with considerable thoroughness, but he could not shake his statement. The only additional facts he learned were that the Lescaut was going to Casablanca on the order of the Moroccan government, to load up a cargo of agricultural samples for the Italian market, and that Monsieur Merkel was accompanying it simply as a holiday trip. With this, French had to be content, and he went to the post office and got through on the long-distance telephone to his chief at the yard. To him he repeated the essentials of the tale, asking him to inquire from the Moroccan authorities as to the truth of their portion of it, as well as to endeavor to trace the Lescaut. On leaving the post office, it occurred to him that communication with the Lescaut should be possible by wireless, and he returned to the Rue des Tanneurs to ascertain this point. There he was told that just after he had left, Monsieur Lowenthal had received a telephone call requiring his immediate presence in Holland, and he had with a great rush caught the afternoon express for the Dutch capital. "Skedaddled, by Jove," said French to himself. "Guess that lets in the Belgian police." He called at headquarters and saw the officer in charge, and before he left to catch the connection for London, it had been arranged that the movements of the junior partner should be gone into, and a watch kept for the return of that enterprising weaver of fairy tales. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. A visitor from India. When French reached Victoria, the first person he saw on the platform was Maxwell Cheyne. "They told me at the yard that you might be on this train," the young man said excitedly as he elbowed his way forward. "Any news? Anything about Miss Merrill?" He looked old and worn, and it was evident that his anxiety was telling on him. In his eagerness, he could scarcely wait for the inspector to dismount from his carriage, and his loud tones were attracting curious looks from the bystanders. "Get a taxi," French answered quietly. "We can talk there." A few seconds later, they found a vehicle, and Cheyne, gripping the other by the arm, went on earnestly. "Tell me, I can see you have learned something. Is she all right?" "I got news of her on Thursday last. She was all right then, though still under the influence of a drug. The whole party has gone to sea." "To sea?" "Yes, to sea in a small tramp. I don't know what they are up to, but there's no reason to suppose that Miss Merrill is otherwise than well. Probably they took her with them to prevent her giving them away. They would drug her to get her to go along, but would cease it as soon as she was on board. I wired for inquiries to be made at the different signal stations, and news may be waiting for us at the yard." A few seconds sufficed to put Cheyne in possession of the salient facts which French had learned, and the latter, in his turn, asked for news. "By Jove, yes," Cheyne cried. "There is news. You remember that Arnold Price had disappeared? Well, yesterday I had a letter from him." "You don't say so," French rejoined in surprise. "Where did he write from?" "Bombay. He was shortly leaving for home. He expects to be here in about a month." "And what about his disappearance?" "He was ill in hospital. He'd gone up to Agra on some private business and met with an accident, was knocked down in the street and was insensible for ages. He couldn't say who he was, and the hospital people in Agra couldn't find out, and he hadn't told the Bombay people where he was going to spend his leave.
Did he mention the letter?
Yes, he thanked me for taking charge of it and said that when he reached home, he would relieve me of further trouble about it. He little knows.
That's so,
French assented. Their taxi had been held up by a block at the end of Westminster Bridge, but now the mass cleared, and in a few seconds they reached the yard. French's first care was to get rid of Cheyne. He repeated what he had learned about Joan Merrill. Then, assuring him that the key of the matter lay in the cipher, he advised him to go home and try it once more. Directly any more news came in, he would let him know. Cheyne having reluctantly taken his departure, French made inquiries as to what had been done in reference to his telephone from Antwerp. It appeared that the yard had not been idle. In the first place, an application had been made to the Moroccan government, who had replied that no ship had been chartered by them for freight at Casablanca, nor was anything known of agricultural samples for the Italian market. Lowenthal's story must therefore have been an absolute fabrication. He had, however, told it so readily that French suspected it had been made up beforehand, so as to be ready to serve up to any inquisitive policeman or detective who might come along. Next, Lloyd's had been approached as to the direction the Lescaut had taken, and a reply had shortly before come in from them. It stated that up to noon on that day, the vessel had not been reported from any of their stations, but this, French realized, might not mean so much. If she had gone south down the English Channel, it would have been well on to dark before she reached the Straits of Dover. In any case, had she wished to slip through unseen, she had only to keep out to the middle of the passage, when, in ordinary weather, she would have been invisible from either coast. On the other hand, had she gone north, she would almost naturally have kept out of sight of land. It was true that in either case, she would have been likely to pass some other vessel which would have spoken her, and the fact that no news of such recognition had come to hand seemed to indicate that she was taking some unusual course out of the track of regular shipping. French wired this information to the Antwerp police, and then, his chief being disengaged, went in and gave him a detailed account of his adventures in Belgium. Chief Inspector Mitchell was impressed by the story. He sat back in his chair and treated French to a prolonged stare as the latter talked. At the end of the recital, he remained sitting motionless for some moments, whistling gently below his breath. "Any theories?" he said at last. French shook his head.
"Well, no, sir," he answered slowly. "It's not easy to see what they're after, and it's not easy to see either why the whole gang wanted to go. It looked at first as if they were just clearing out because of Cheyne's coming to the yard, but it's more than that. The arrangements were made too long ago. They have been dealing with that Antwerp firm for several weeks."
"The hard copper was all a story?"
"Looks like it, sir. As a matter of fact, every single statement those men made that could be tested has been proved false. Even when there didn't seem any great object in a yarn, they pitched it. Lies seemed to come easier to them."
"Well, I've known a few good cases of that, and so have you, French. It's a habit that grows. Now, what's your next move?" French hesitated.
"For the moment, the outlook's not very cheery," he said at last. "All the same, I can't believe that boat can go away out of the Scheldt and disappear. In my judgment, she's bound to be reported before long, and I'm looking forward to getting word of her within the next day or so. Then, I have no doubt that the tracing is some kind of cipher, and if we could read it, we should probably get light on the whole affair."
"Why shouldn't you read it? Try it again."
"I intend to, sir, but I don't hope for much result, because I don't believe we've got the genuine document. I don't believe they would have handed it, nor a copy of it either, to a man they intended to murder, lest it should be found on his body. I'd state long odds they gave him a fake."
"I think you're probably right," the chief admitted. "Try at all events. You never know your luck." He bent over his desk, and French, realizing that the interview had come to an end, quietly left the room. Then, seeing there was nothing requiring his attention urgently, and tired after his journey, he went home. But contrary to his expectations, the next day passed without any news of the Lescaut, and the next, and many days after that, nor could all his efforts with the tracing throw any light on that mysterious document. As time passed, he began to grow more and more despondent, and the fear that he was going to make a mess of the case grew steadily stronger. In vain he laid his difficulties before his wife. For once that final source of inspiration failed him. Mrs. French did not take even one illuminating notion. When the third week had gone by, something akin to despair seized upon the inspector. The only possibility of hope now seemed to lie in the return of Arnold Price, and French began counting the days until his arrival. One night, about 3 weeks after his return from Belgium, he settled down with a cigar after dinner, his thoughts running in their familiar groove. What were these people engaged on? Was there any way in which he could find out? Had he overlooked any evidence or any inquiries? Had he neglected any possible line of research? The more he considered the affair in all its bearings, the more conscious he became of the soundness of the advice he had given to Cheyne, and which in his turn he had received from his chief. Unquestionably in the tracing lay the solution he required, and once again he racked his brains to see if he could not by any means devise a way to read its message. On this point he concentrated, going over and over again everything he had learned about it. For perhaps an hour he remained motionless in his chair, while the smoke from his cigar curled up and slowly dissolved into the blue haze with which the room was becoming obscured. And then, suddenly, he sat up and with a dawning, tremulous eagerness considered an idea which had just leaped into his mind. He had suddenly remembered a statement made by Cheyne when he was giving his first rather incoherent account of his adventures. The young man said that it had been arranged between himself and Joan Merrill that if either were lucky enough to get the tracing into his or her possession, the first thing he or she would do would be to photograph it. Now, in juxtaposition with that statement, French recalled the facts. First, that Joan must have reached her flat on the night of her abduction at least several minutes before Blessington and Syme arrived with their car. And secondly, that during those minutes she had the tracing with her, the genuine tracing, as there was every reason to believe. Had Joan photographed it? French was overwhelmed with amazement and chagrin at his failure to think of this point before. Nor could he acquit Cheyne of a like astounding stupidity. For himself, he felt there was no excuse whatever. He had even specially noticed the girl's camera and the flashlight apparatus which she used for her architectural details when he was searching her rooms, but he had then, and since then up till this moment, entirely and completely forgotten the arrangement made between the partners. Late as it was, French decided to go then and there to ascertain the point. The key of Joan's flat was at the yard, and 20 minutes later he had obtained it and was in a taxi bowling towards Horn Terrace. He kept the vehicle while he ran up the 10 flights to number 12 and secured the camera. Then, hastening down, he was driven back to the yard. By a piece of good luck he found a photographer who had been delayed by other important work, and him he pressed into the service forthwith. With some grumbling, the man returned to his dark room, French, too eager to await his report, accompanying him. A few moments sufficed to settle the question. The camera contained a roll of films, of which the first 7 had been exposed, and a short immersion in the developer showed that numbers 5, 6, and 7 bore the hoped-for impress. Gone was French's despondency and the weariness caused by his heavy day, and instead, he was once more the embodiment of enthusiasm and cheery optimism. He had it now. At last, the secret was within his grasp. Of his ability to read the message, now that he was sure he had the genuine one, he had no doubt. He had always liked working out ciphers, and since he had succeeded in extracting the hidden meaning from the stock and share lists which had been sent to the elusive Mrs. X in the Gething murder case, His belief in his own powers had become almost an obsession. He could hardly restrain his eagerness to get to grips with this new problem until the negatives should be dry and prints made. The photographer was able to promise these for the following day. Until then, French had to possess his soul in patience. But on his return from lunch, he found on his desk 3 excellent prints of the document. They were only half-plate size, or about 1/3 that of the tracing which had been given to Cheyne. He therefore instructed the photographer to prepare enlargements which would bring the document up to more nearly the size of the original. These were ready before it was time for him to leave for home, and he sat down with ill-controlled excitement to compare them with the document at which he had already spent so much time. And then he suddenly experienced one of the most bitter disappointments of his life. To all intents and purposes, the two were the same. There were the same circles, the same numbers, letters, and signs enclosed therein, the same phrase, "England expects every man to do his duty," spaced round in the same way. The tracing had not been very accurately done, as some of the circles seemed slightly out of place, but the discrepancies were trifling and seemed obviously due to careless copying. He gave vent to a single bitter oath, then sat motionless, wrapped in the most profound gloom. He took tracing and photographs home with him, and spent the greater part of the evening making a minute comparison between the two. The enlargement, unfortunately, was not exactly the same size as the tracing, and he therefore began his work by covering the surfaces of both with proportionate squares. Taking the tracing first, he drew parallel lines 1 inch apart, both up and down it and across, thus covering its whole surface with inch squares. Then he divided the prints into the same number of equal parts, both vertically and horizontally, and ruled them up in squares also. These squares were slightly smaller than the others, about 7/8 of an inch only, but relatively the lines fell on each in the same positions. A comparison according to the squares thus showed at a glance similarity or otherwise between the two documents. As he examined them in detail, certain interesting facts began to emerge. The general appearance, the words, "England expects every man to do his duty," and the circles with their attendant letters and numbers were identical on both sheets, but there were striking variations. The position of certain of the circles was different. Those containing numbers and crooked lines were all slightly out of place, while those containing letters remained unmoved. Moreover, the little crooked lines, while preserving a rough resemblance to the originals, were altered in shape. The more he considered the matter, the more evident it became to French that these divergences were intentional. The tracing which had been given to Cheyne was intended to resemble the other superficially, and did so resemble it, but it had clearly been faked to make it valueless. If French were right so far, and he had but little doubt of it, it followed that the essential feature of the circles and crooked lines was position. This, he felt, should be a useful hint, but as yet he could not see where it led. He pondered fruitlessly over the problem till the small hours, and next morning he took the documents back to the yard to continue his studies. But he did not have an opportunity to do so. Other work was waiting for him. To his delight, he found that Arnold Price had reached home, and that he and Cheyne were waiting to see him. Price proved to be a lanky and rather despondent-looking individual, with a skin burned to the color of copper, and a pair of exceedingly shrewd blue eyes. He dropped into the chair French indicated, and instantly pulled out and lit a well-blackened cutty pipe.
"Got in yesterday morning," he announced laconically, "and wired Torquay I was going down. By the merest luck, I got a reply before I started that Cheyne was in town. I looked him up, and here I am."
French smiled pleasantly. Though interested in the man, he could not help noting with some amusement at once the restraint and the completeness of his statement. How refreshing, he thought, and how rare, to meet someone who will give you the pith of a story without frills.
"I'm glad to meet you, Mr. Price,"
he said cordially.
"I suppose Mr. Cheyne has told you the effect that your letter has had on us all?"
The other nodded.
Not altogether surprising, he declared. There's money in the thing, or so I always believed, and this other crowd must believe it too, though how they got on to the affair licks me. We shall be very interested to hear what you can tell us about it, French prompted. Will you smoke, Mr. Cheyne? He held out his cigar case. I can't tell you much, Price returned, and nothing that will clear up this blessed mystery that seems to have started up. But this is my story for what it's worth. Before the war, I was on one of the Hudson and Spence boats, and I had the luck to get into the R&R when hostilities broke out. I stayed on in my old ship till she was torpedoed a couple of years later. Then I was appointed third officer on the Morania. We were on a trip from South Africa to Brest with army stores, when one day, just as we came into the English Channel, we were attacked by a U-boat. We had an 18-pounder forward, and by a stroke of luck we gave old Fritz one on the knob that did him in. The boat went down, and a dozen of the crew were left swimming. We put out a boat and picked one or two of them up. The skipper was clinging onto a lifebelt, but just as he came up, he let go and began to sink. I was in charge of the boat, and some fool notion came over me. I think in the hurry I forgot he was a U-boat skipper. But anyhow, like a fool, I got overboard and got hold of him. It was nothing like a dramatic rescue. There was no danger to me, and we were back on board inside 15 minutes.
French and Cheyne were listening intently to this familiar story. So far it was almost word for word that told by Dangle. Apparently, then, there was at least one point on which the latter had told the truth.
We weren't out of trouble, Price resumed, and next day we came up against another submarine. We exchanged a few shots, and then a British destroyer came up and drove him off. But I had the luck to stop a splinter of shell, and when we got to Brest, I was sent to hospital. The U-boat skipper had got a crack on the head when his boat went down, and he was sent in too. By a chance, we got side-by-side beds in the same ward and used to talk a bit, though he was a rotter, even for a Boche.
Price paused to draw on his cuddy pipe, expelling great clouds of smoke of a peculiarly acrid and penetrating quality. Then, the others not speaking, he went on.
It turned out that the wound on Schultz's head, his name was Schultz, was serious, and he grew steadily worse. Then one night when the ward was quiet, he woke me and said he knew his number was up and that he had a secret to tell me. We listened, but all the other fellows seemed asleep, and then he told me he could put me in the way of a fortune, that he had hoped to get it himself after the war, but now that it would be a job for someone else. He said he would tell me the whole thing, and that I might make what I could out of it, if only I would pledge myself to give 1/8 of what I got to his wife. He gave me the address, somewhere in Breslau. He asked me to swear this, and I did, and then he took a packet from under his pillow and handed it to me. There, he said, the whole thing's there. I put it in cipher for safety, but I'll tell you how to read it. Well, he began to do so, but just then a sister came in, and he shut up till she would leave. But the excitement of talking about the thing must have been too much for him. He got a weak turn and never spoke again.
But, Cheyne interposed, what about the hard copper? Dangle told us about Schultz's discovery. Price gazed at him vacantly for some moments, and then suddenly smote the table. I've got it, he cried with an oath. Dangle, I remember that chap now. He was in the next bed on the other side of Schultz. That's right. I couldn't call him to mind when you mentioned him before. Of course, he heard the whole tale, and that's what started him on this do. I know, Cheyne returned. He admitted that all right, but he told us about the hard copper. You haven't mentioned that. Price shook his head. Don't know what you're talking about, he declared. What do you mean by hard copper? Dangle mentioned it. He was listening to the conversation. He told us all that about Schultz's story of the fortune and about his wife and all that, just as you have. But he said Schultz went on to explain what the fortune was. that he had hit on a way of treating copper that made it as hard as steel. The cipher contained the formula. Again, Price shook his head.
All spoof, he observed. Not a word of truth in it. Schultz never mentioned copper or said anything more than I've told you.
French spoke for the first time.
We found this Dangle a man of imagination all through, and it is easy to see why he invented that particular yarn. By that time he had undoubtedly read the cipher and wanted something to mislead Mr. Cheyne as to its contents. The story of the hard copper would start a bias in Mr. Cheyne's mind, which would tend to keep him off the real scent.
He paused, but his companions, not speaking, continued.
Now we have that bias cleared away. At least one interesting fact emerges. The whole business starts with the sea, the U-boat commander Schultz, and it looks as if it was going to end up with the sea, the tramp, the Lescaut.
As French said these words, an idea flashed into his mind, and he went on deliberately, but with growing excitement.
And when we connect the idea of a U-boat commander giving a message which ends with a sea expedition, with the fact which I have just discovered, that the essence of his cipher is the position of the markings on it, we seem to be getting somewhere.
Price smote his thigh.
By Jemima, he cried, I've got you. That blessed tracing is a map. A map, yes. That's what I think,
French answered eagerly, and then, as suddenly he saw the possible significance of Nelson's exhortation, he went on dramatically,
A map of England.
Cheyne swore softly. My word, if we aren't a set of blithering idiots, he exclaimed. Of course. England is the title. That's as clear as day. The other words are added as a blind. Let's have the thing out, Inspector, and see if we can't make something of it now. As French produced his enlarged photographs, not one of the three men doubted that they were at last well on the way towards wresting the secret from the document which had so long baffled them. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. The message of the tracing. Inspector French spread the photograph on his desk, and Cheyne and Price, having drawn up chairs, all three gazed at it as if expecting that in the light of their great idea, its message would have become obvious. But in this they were disappointed. The suggestion did not seem in any way to help either French or Cheyne, and Price, who of course had not seen the document before, was satisfactorily mystified. Granted that the thing was a map, granted even that it was a map of England, its meaning remained just as provokingly hidden as ever. Presently Price gave vent to an exclamation.
Hang it all,
he cried irritably, and then,
I suppose those numbers couldn't be soundings. Could they give depths at the circles?
That's an idea, Cheyne cried, but French shook his head.
I think there's more in it than that, he observed. If you examine those numbers, you'll find that they're consecutive. They run from 1 to 36. Soundings wouldn't lend themselves to such an arrangement. You may be right, Mr. Price, and we must keep your idea in view. But I don't see it working out for the moment.
Silence reigned for a few moments. Then Price sat back from the table and spoke again.
Look here, Inspector,
he said, knocking the ashes out of his pipe and beginning to fill it with his strong black mixture.
You said something just now I didn't quite follow. Let's get your notion clear. You talked of this thing beginning with the sea, at Schultz, and ending with the sea, at Lescaut, and Schultz's message being a map. Just what was in your mind? Only the obvious suggestion that if you leave a message which provokes an expedition, you must also convey in your message the destination of that expedition, and a map seems the simplest way of doing it. But on second thoughts, I question my first conclusion. There must be an explanation of the secret, as well as a direction of how to profit by it. and it would seem to me doubtful that such an explanation could be covered by a map." "Sounds all right, that," Price admitted. "Have you any idea what the secret might be? Sounds like a treasure, or salvage, or something of that kind." "I scarcely think salvage," French answered. "The Lascaux is not a salvage boat, and a boat not specially fitted for the purpose would be of little use. But I thought of treasure all right. This Schultz might have robbed his ships. There would always be money aboard, and even during the war many women traveled with jewelry. The man might easily have made a cache of valuables somewhere round the coast."
Easily, Cheyne intervened. Or he might have learned of some valuable deposit in some out-of-the-way cove round the coast, like those chaps in that clinking tale of Maurice Drake's WO2.
"Is that Terneuzen?" said French. "I read that book. One of the best I ever came across. It's a possibility, of course."
The talk here became somewhat rambling, Price not having read WO2 and wanting to know what it was about, but French soon reverted to his photograph. He reminded his hearers that they were all interested in its elucidation. Miss Merrill's safety, his own professional credit, Cheyne's peace of mind, and Price's fortune, all were at stake.
"We have," he went on, "evolved the idea that perhaps this tracing may be a map of England. On further thought, that suggestion does not seem promising, but as we have no other, let us work on it. Assume it is a map of England, and let us see if it leads us anywhere."
There were murmurs of assent from his hearers, and he continued.
"Now it seems to me the first thing to do is to try if we can fit these circles and lines into the map of England. Is there anything corresponding to them in English geography?"
No one being able to answer this query, French went on.
"I think we must distinguish between the letter circles on the one hand and those of the numbers and lines on the other. The position of the former was not altered in the faked copy. That of the latter was. From this, may we not assume that the message lies in the numbers and lines only? Possibly the letters were added as a blind, as we have already assumed the words, 'expects every man to do his duty' were added as a blind to 'England.' Suppose at all events that we eliminate the letter circles and concentrate on the others for our first effort."
"That sounds all right."
"Good. Let us go a step further. Have you noticed the distribution of the numbers, letters, and lines? The numbers are bunched, roughly speaking, towards the center, the letters round the edge, and the irregular lines between the two. Does this central mass give us anything?"
"I get you," Price replied. He had risen and begun to pace the room, but now he returned to the table and stood looking down at the photograph.
"You know, as a matter of fact," he went on slowly, "if, as you say, you take that central part which contains numbers only, the shape of the thing is not so very unlike England after all. Suppose the numbers represent land and the letters sea. Then this patch of letters in the top left-hand corner might be the Irish Sea, and this larger patch to the right the North Sea. And look, the letter circles form a band across the bottom. What price that for the English Channel?"
French crossed the room and, taking a small atlas from a shelf, opened it at the map of England and laid it down beside the photograph. With a rising excitement, all three compared them. Then Cheyne burst out irritably. "Confound the thing! It's like it and it's not like it. Let's draw a line round those number circles and see if it makes anything like the shape." He seized the photograph and took out a pencil. But just as in the scientific and industrial worlds, discoveries and inventions seldom come singly, so among these three men the begetting of ideas begot more ideas. Scarcely had Cheyne spoken when French made a little gesture of comprehension.
"I believe I have it at last,"
he said quietly, but with ill-concealed eagerness in his tones.
"Those irregular lines in certain of the circles are broken bits of the coastline. See here, those two between 8 and U are surely the Wash, and that below H is Flamborough Head. Let's see if we can locate correspondingly shaped outlines on the atlas, and fill in between those on the photograph with pencil."
A few seconds' examination only were needed. Opposite, but slightly above the projection which French suggested as Flamborough Head, was an angled line between GU and 31, which all three simultaneously pronounced St. B's Head. Short double lines on each side of 24 showed two parts of the estuary of the Severn, and projections along the bottom near X and 27 were evidently St. Albans Head and Selsey Bill. That they were on the right track, there could now no longer be any doubt, and they set themselves with renewed energy to the problem still remaining, the meaning of the circles and the numbers they contained.
"We can't locate the blessed things this way," French pointed out. "We'll have to rule squares on the atlas to correspond. Then we can pencil in the coastline accurately and see just where the circles lie."
For a time, measuring and the drawing of lines were the order of the day, and then at last the positions of the circles were located. They were all drawn around towns.
"Towns!"
Price exclaimed.
"Guess we're getting on."
"Towns," Cheyne echoed in his turn. "Then you must have been right, Inspector, about those letters being merely a blind."
"I think so," French admitted. "Look at it in this way. If only the towns and coast were marked, the shape of England would show too clearly. But adding those letter circles disguises the thing, prevents the shape becoming apparent. Now I may be wrong, but I am beginning to question very much if this map has anything to do with indicating a position. I mean directly. I am beginning to think it is merely a cipher. Let us test this at all events. Let us write down the names of the towns in the order of the numbers and see if that gives us anything."
He took a sheet of paper, while Price found number 1 on the photograph, and Cheyne identified its position with that of a town on the atlas map. "Number 1, said Cheyne, "is Salisbury." French wrote down,
1, Salisbury.
"Number 2, went on Cheyne, "is Immingham."
2, Immingham,
wrote French as he remarked.
"Salisbury, Immingham, S, I. That goes all right so far."
The next 3 towns were Liverpool, Atoxeter, and Reading, and though none of the men could see where SILUR was leading, it was at least pronounceable. But when the next 3 letters were added, French gave a mighty shout of victory. Number 6 was Ipswich, number 7 Andover, and number 8 Nottingham, IAN, added to SILUR, made Silurian.
"Silurian!"
French cried, striking the table a mighty blow with his clenched fist.
"Silurian! That begins to show a light."
The others stared.
"Don't you recognize the name?" went on French. "The Silurian was a big anchor liner, and she was torpedoed on her way to the States, with 2.5 millions in gold bars aboard."
The others held their breath, and their eyes grew round. "Any of it recovered?"
"None. It was in mid-Atlantic."
"But," stammered Cheyne at last, "I don't follow."
"I don't follow myself,"
French returned briskly.
"But when the cipher which leads to a maritime expedition begins with a wreck, with 2.5 millions aboard, well then, I say it is suggestive. Come along, let's read the rest of the thing. We'll know more then."
With breathless eagerness, the other towns were looked up, and at last French's list read as follows: 1, Salisbury, 2, Immingham, 3, Liverpool, 4, Atoxeter, 5, Reading, 6, Ipswich, 7, Andover, 8, Nottingham, 9, Oxford, 10, Northampton, 11, Evesham, 12, Doncaster, 13, Exeter, 14, Gloucester, 15, Ripon, 16, Ely, 17, Eastbourne, 18, Wigan, 19, Exmouth, 20, Swansea, 21, Tunbridge, 22, Nuneaton, 23, Ilfracombe, 24, Newport, 25, Eaglescliffe, 26, Taunton. 27, Eastleigh. 28, Ebbvale. 29, Northallerton. 30, Folkestone. 31, Appleby. 32, Tamworth. 33, Huntingdon. 34, Oldham. 35, Middlesbrough. 36, Southend. Taking the initials in order, read Silurian 1 degree west 19 fathoms, or dividing it into its obvious words, Silurian 1 degree west 19 fathoms. The three men stared at one another.
19 fathoms, Price gasped at last. But if she's in 19 fathoms, that gold will be salvable.
French nodded.
And I guess Dangle and company have gone to salve it. They wouldn't want a salvage boat for gold. They'd get it with a diver's outfit.
But, Cheyne went on in a puzzled tone, I've not got this straight yet. If she's in 19 fathoms, why has she not been salved by the Admiralty? Look at the Laurentic. She was put down off the Swilly in Ireland, and they salved her gold, 5 million pounds worth. Salved practically every penny, and in 20 fathoms too. Price was considering another problem.
1 degree west, he murmured. What under heaven does that mean? 1 degree west of what? Surely not the meridian of Greenwich. If so, what is the latitude? There's no mention of it.
French could not answer either of the questions, and he did not try. Instead, he picked up his telephone receiver and made a call.
Hello? Is that Lloyd's? Put me through to the record department, please. Is Mr. Sam Puller there? Tell him Inspector French of Scotland Yard wants to speak to him. Hello? Sam? Yes. Haven't seen you for ages. Look here, Sam. I want you to do me a favor. It's rather urgent, and I'd be grateful if you could look after it just now. Yes, I'll hold on. I want to know anything you can tell me about the sinking of the Silurian. You remember? She had 2.5 million on her in gold, and the U-boats got her somewhere between this country and the States. I think in 17. What's that? Yes, all that and anything else you can tell me.
He took the receiver from his ear.
Friend of mine in Lloyd's, he explained. We ought to get some light from his reply.
Silence reigned for a couple of minutes. Then French spoke again.
Let me repeat that, he said,
seizing a pad and scribbling furiously.
Latitude 41 degrees, 36 minutes north. Longitude 28 degrees, 53 minutes west. Right. How was that known? But there was no direct information? Was the gold insured? Well, it's an involved business I could hardly tell you over the phone. I'll explain it first time we meet. Thank you, Sam. Much obliged.
He rang off and then made a departmental call.
Put me through to Inspector Burns. That you, Burns? I'm on to something a bit in your line. Could you come down here for half an hour? Burns is our authority on things nautical, he told the others. Began life as a sailor and has studied all branches of sea lore. We always give him shipping cases. We'll wait till he comes, and then I'll tell you what I learned from Lloyd's.
Isn't it a strange thing, Cheyne remarked, that Schultz should have chosen England for his map and English for his cipher? Wouldn't the natural thing have been for him to have chosen Germany in German? He could have headed it, for instance, Deutschland über alles, and used the initials of German towns for his phrase.
I thought of that, French returned. But we have to remember he prepared the cipher to mislead Germans, not English. In that case, I think he was right to use English. It made the thing more difficult.
He had scarcely finished speaking when the door opened, and a tall, alert-looking young man entered the room. French introduced him as Inspector Burns and pointed to a chair.
Seat yourself, Burns, and listen to my tale. These gentlemen are concerned with a curious story.
And he gave a brief resume of the strange events which had led up to the existing situation.
Now, he went on, when we found it was connected with the Silurian, I rang up Sam Puller at Lloyd's, and this is what he told me. The Silurian sailed from this country on the 16th of February, 1917. She was bound for New York, and she had 2.5 million on her in bullion, as well as a fair number of passengers. She was a big boat, an anchor liner of some 15,000 tons. You remember about her?
Well, I should think so, Burns returned as he lit a cigarette. Why, I was on that job. Getting her away, I mean. All kinds of precautions were taken. A tale was started that she would load up the gold at Plymouth and would sail. I forget the exact date now, but it was 3 days after she did sail. It was my job to see that the German spies about Plymouth got hold of this tale, and we had evidence that they did get it, and moreover sent it through to Germany, and that the U-boats were instructed accordingly. As a matter of fact, the Silurian came from Brest, where she had landed army stores from South America, and the bullion went out in a tender from Folkestone and was transferred at night in the Channel, in the middle of a ring of destroyers. While preparations were being made at Plymouth for her arrival, she was away hundreds of miles towards the States.
But they got her all the same.
Oh yes, they got her, but not all the same. She escaped the boats that were looking out for her. It was a chance boat that found her, somewhere, if I remember rightly, near the Azores.
That's right, French answered. Instead of going directly west, so Sam Puller told me, she went south to avoid those submarines you spoke of, and which were supposed to be operating off the Land's End. Her course was followed by wireless, down to near the Spanish coast, and then across fairly due west. She was last seen by a Cape boat, some 30 miles west of Finisterre. Then a message was received from her when she was some 250 miles north of the Azores, that a U-boat had come along and had ordered her to stop. The message gave her position and went on to say that a boat was coming aboard from the submarine. Then it stopped, and that was the last thing that was heard of her. Not a body or a boat or a bit of wreckage was ever picked up, and it was clear that everyone on board was lost. Then, after a time, confirmation was obtained. Our intelligence people in Germany intercepted a report from the commander of the submarine who sank her, giving details. She had been sunk in latitude 41 degrees 36 minutes north, longitude 28 degrees 53 minutes west, which confirmed the figure set out in her last wireless message. 4 boats had got away, but the commander had fired on them and had sunk them one after another, so that not a single member of the passengers or crew should survive.
Dirty savages, Burns commented, but people in open boats wouldn't have had much chance there anyway, particularly in February. If they had been able to keep afloat at all, they would probably have missed the Azores, and it's very unlikely they would have made the Spanish or Portuguese coast. It would have been too far. French pushed forward his atlas.
Just whereabouts did she sink?
He inquired. About there. Burns indicated a point north of the Azores. But this atlas is too small to see it. Send someone to my room for my large atlas. You'll see better on that. French having telephoned his instructions, Burns went on. She's evidently lying on what is called the Dolphin Rise. The Dolphin Rise is part of a great ridge which passes down the middle of the Atlantic from near Iceland to well down towards the Antarctic Ocean. This ridge is covered by an average of some 1,700 fathoms of water, with vastly greater depths on either side. It is volcanic and is covered by great submarine mountain chains. Where the tops of these mountains protrude above the surface, we get, of course, islands, and the Azores are such a group. A constable at that moment entered with the large atlas, and Burns continued. Now we'll see in a moment. He ran his finger down the index of maps, then turned the pages. Here we are. Here is a map of the North Atlantic Ocean. Here are the Azores, and hereabouts is your point. And, by Jove, the young man looked actually excited. Here is what your cipher means, all right. The other 3 crowded round in almost breathless excitement. Burns pointed with a pencil slightly to the east of a white spot, about 1/4 of an inch in diameter, which bore the figure 18. Look here, he went on. There's about the point she is supposed to have sunk. You see it is colored light blue, which the reference tells us means over 1,000 fathoms. But measure 1 degree to the west. It is about 50 miles at that latitude, and it brings us into the middle of that white patch marked 18. That white patch is another mountain chain, just not high enough to become an island, and the 18 means that the peaks come within 18 fathoms of the surface. So that your cipher message is probably quite all right, and your Antwerp party are more than likely working away at the gold at the present time. French swore comprehensively.
You must be right, he agreed. One can see now what that blackguard of a U-boat commander did. He evidently put some men aboard the Silurian to dismantle their wireless, then made them sail on parallel to his own course until he had, by the use of his lead, maneuvered them over the highest peak and then put them down. The whole thing must have been quite deliberate. He returned to his own government a false statement of her position, which he knew would correspond with the last message she sent out, intending it to be believed that she was lost in over 1,000 fathoms. But he sank her where he could himself afterwards recover her bullion, or sell his secret to the highest bidder. The people on the Silurian would know all about that 2 or 3 hours steam west, so they must be got rid of. Hence his destroying the boats one after another. No one must be left alive to give the thing away. To his own crew, he no doubt told some tale to account for it, but he would be safe enough there, as no one except himself would know the actual facts. Dirty savage indeed. With this speech of French's, a light seemed to Cheyne suddenly to shine out over all that strange adventure in which for so many weeks he had been involved. With it, each puzzling fact seemed to become comprehensible and to drop into its natural place in the story, as the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle eventually make a coherent whole. He pictured the thing from the beginning, the submarine coming up with the ship in deep water, but comparatively close to a shallow place where its treasure could be salved. The desire of the U-boat commander Schultz to save the gold, quite possibly in the first instance for the benefit of his nation. Then, the temptation to keep what he had done secret so as, if possible later, to get the stuff for himself. His fall before this temptation, with its contingent false return to his government as to the position of the wreck. Then, Cheyne saw, the problem of passing on the secret in the event of his own death would arise, with the evolution and construction of the cipher as an attempted solution. As a result of Schultz's fatal wound, the cipher was handed to Price, and Schultz was doubtless about to explain how it should be read when he was interrupted by the nurse. Before another chance offered, he was dead. Given the fact that Dangle overheard the dying man's story, and that Dangle's character was what it was, Cheyne now saw that the remainder of his adventure could scarcely have happened otherwise than as it had. To obtain the cipher was Dangle's obvious course, and there was no reason to doubt his own statement of how he set about it. A search among Price's papers showed the latter had sent the document to Cheyne, and from Cheyne, Dangle had evidently decided to obtain it. But nothing could be done till after the war, nor, presumably, without financial and other help. In this lay, doubtless, the reason for the application to Blessington and Syme, and these two being roped in, the unscrupulous trio set themselves to work. Susan Dangle assisted by obtaining a post as servant at Warren Lodge, and thus gained detailed information which enabled the others to lay their plans. And so, in a quite orderly sequence, event had followed event, until now it looked as if the climax had been reached. Like a flash, these thoughts passed through Cheyne's mind, and like a flash he saw what depended on them. Now they knew where Joan Merrill had been taken, if she was still alive, and he simply could not bring himself to admit any other possibility. She was on that boat of Merkel's some 250 miles north of the Azores. From that something surely followed. He turned to French and spoke in a voice which was hoarse from anxiety. "What about an expedition to the place?" French nodded decisively. "We must arrange one without delay," he said. "I think the Admiralty is our hope. That gold wasn't insured. It was a government business. I'll go and tell the chief about it now and get him to see the proper authorities. Meanwhile," he looked, for French, quite sharply at the others, "not a word of this must be breathed." Intense interest was excited in the higher circles of the Admiralty by the news which reached them from the yard. Great personages bestirred themselves to issue orders, with the result that with enormously more promptitude than the man in the street can bring himself to associate with a government department, a fast boat, well equipped with divers and gear, was got ready for sea. French put in a word for both Cheyne and Price, and when, some 8 hours after their reading of the cipher, the boat put out into the Thames from Chatham Dockyard, it carried, in addition to its regular crew, not only Inspector French himself, but also his 2 protégés. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. The goal of the Lescaut. Inspector French had gone to bed in the tiny but comfortable stateroom which had been put at his disposal by the officers of the Admiralty boat, while that redoubtable vessel was slipping easily and on an even keel through the calm waters of the Straits of Dover. He awoke next morning to find her plunging and rolling and staggering through what, in comparison with his previous experiences of the sea, appeared to be a frightful storm. To his surprise, however, he did not feel any bad effects from the motion, and presently he arose, and having with extreme care performed the ticklish operation of shaving, dressed and climbed with the aid of railings and handles to the companionway, and so to the deck. The sight which met his eyes on emerging made him hold his breath, as he clung to the rail at the companion door. It was a wonderful morning, clear and bright and fresh and invigorating. The sun shone down from a cloudless sky onto a dark sapphire sea of incredible purity, flecked over with foaming patches of dazzling white. As far as the eye could reach in every direction out to the hard, sharp line of the horizon, great waves rolled relentlessly onward, wavelets dancing and churning and foaming on their slow-moving flanks. The wind caught French, and, as if it were a solid, held him pinned against the deck-house. He stood watching the bluff bows of the boat rise in the air, then crash back into the sea, throwing out a smother of water and foam, some of which would seep over the forecastle, and after swirling through the forward deck hamper, disappear through the scuppers amidships. For some moments he watched. Then moving round the deck-house, he glanced up and saw Cheyne and Price beckoning to him from the bridge, where they had joined the officer of the watch. "Some morning this, Inspector," Price cried as he joined them in the lee of the weather canvas. "This will blow the London cobwebs out of our minds." He was evidently keenly enjoying himself, and even Cheyne's anxious face showed appreciation of his surroundings. And soon French himself, having realized that they were not necessarily going to the bottom in a hurricane, but merely running down channel in a fresh southwesterly breeze, began to feel the thrill of the sea, and to believe that the end of his quest was going to develop into a novel and delightful holiday trip. The same weather held all that day, and the next, but on the third the wind fell, and the sea gradually calmed down to a slow, easy swell. The sun grew hotter, and basking in it in the lee of the deck-house became a delight. Little was said about the object of the expedition. French and Price were content to enjoy the present, and Cheyne managed to keep his anxieties to himself. The ship's officers were a jolly crowd, immensely excited by their quest, and conducting themselves as the kindly hosts of welcome guests. On the fourth day, it grew still warmer. Indeed, out of the breeze made by the ship's motion, it was unpleasantly hot. French liked to get away forward, where it was cooler, and lean by the hour over the bows, watching the sharp stem cut through the water and roll back in its frothing wave on either side. Dolphins were now to be seen swimming in the clear water, and 2 hung at the bows, 1 on each side, apparently motionless for long periods, until suddenly they would dart ahead,
spiral round one another, and then return to their places. The fourth evening, the captain joined his passengers as the trio were smoking on deck.
"If we carry on like this," he remarked, "we should reach the position about 4 a.m. But those beggars may be taking a risk and not showing a light. So I propose to slow down from now on, in order not to arrive till daylight. Come on deck about 6. If they're here, we should raise them between then and 7.
French, waking early next morning, could not control his excitement and remain in his berth until the allotted time. He rose at 5 and went on deck with the somewhat shamefaced feeling that he was acting as a small boy, who on Christmas morning must needs get up on waking to investigate the possibilities of stockings. But he need not have feared ridicule from his companions. Both Cheyne and Price were already on the bridge, and the skipper stood with his telescope glued to his eye as he searched the horizon ahead. All three were evidently thrilled by the approaching finale, and a slight incoherence was discernible in their somewhat scrappy conversation. The morning was calm and very clear. Once again the sky was cloudless, and the soft southwesterly wind barely ruffled the surface of the long flat swells. It was a pleasure to be alive, and it seemed impossible to associate crime and violence with the expedition. But beneath their smiles, all concerned felt it might easily develop into a grim enough business, and that side of it became more apparent when at the captain's orders the covers of the 6-pounders mounted fore and aft were removed, and the weapons were prepared for action by their crews. The hands of French's watch had just reached the quarter hour after 6, when Captain Amory, who had once again been sweeping the horizon with his telescope, said quietly, "There she is." He handed the glass to French. "See there? About 3 points on the starboard bow." French, with some difficulty steadying the tube, saw very faint and far off what looked like the upper part of a steamer's deck, with a funnel and 2 masts like threads of the finest gossamer. "She's still hull down," the captain explained. "You'll see her better in a few minutes. We should be up with her in 3/4 of an hour." In order to leave them free later on, it was decided to have breakfast at once, and by the time the hasty meal had been disposed of, the stranger was clearly visible to the naked eye. She lay heading westward, as though anchored in the swing of the tide, and her fires appeared to be either out or banked, as no smoke was visible at her funnel. The glass revealed the flag at her forepeak, but she was still too far off to make out its coloring. Now that the dramatic climax was approaching, the minds of the actors in the play became charged with a very real anxiety. Captain Amory, under almost any circumstances, would have to deal with a very ticklish situation. He had to get the gold, if it was salvable, and the fact that they were not in British waters would be a complication if the Belgian had already recovered it. French had to ascertain if his quarry were on board, and if so, see that they did not escape him. Also a difficult job outside the 3-mile limit. For Price, a fortune hung in the balance. Not, of course, all the gold that might be found, but the proportion allowed him by law. While for Cheyne there remained something 1,000 times more important than the capture of a criminal or the acquisition of a fortune. For Cheyne, the question of Joan Merrill's life was at stake. Their several anxieties were reflected on the faces of the men as they stood in silence, watching the rapidly growing vessel. Presently, an exclamation came from Captain Amory. "By Jove," he said, "this is a rum business. I can see that flag now, and it's our red ensign. What's a Belgian boat doing with a British flag? And what's more, it's jacked down, a flag of distress. What do you think of that?" He looked at the others with a puzzled expression, then went on. "I suppose they're not armed. You don't know, Inspector, do you? If they were armed, it would be a likely enough ruse to get us close by, so as to make sure of hitting us in a vital place." French shook his head. He had heard nothing about arms, though for all he knew to the contrary, the Lescaut might carry a gun. "I don't see one," the captain continued. "But then, if they have one, they'd keep it hidden. But I don't like there being no signs of life aboard her. There's no smoke anywhere, either from her boilers or her galley. There's no one on the bridge,
and I've not seen a movement on deck. It doesn't look well. In fact, it looks as if they were lying low and waiting for us."
They were now within a mile of the stranger, and her details were clear even to the naked eye.
"It's the Lascaux anyway," Captain Amory went on. "I can see her name on her bows. But I confess I don't like that flag and that silence. I think I'll see if I can wake her up."
He put his hand on the foghorn halyard and blew a number of resounding blasts. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly 2 figures appeared at the deckhouse door, and after a moment's pause, rushed up on the bridge and began waving furiously. As they passed up the bridge ladder, they came from behind the shelter of a boat, and their silhouettes became visible against the sky. They were both women. A strangled cry burst from Cheyne as he snatched the captain's telescope and gazed at them. Then with a shout of, "It's she! It's she!" he leaped to the end of the bridge and began waving his hat frantically. At this moment, 2 other figures appeared on the forecastle, and apparently moving to the vessel's side, stood watching the newcomers. Amory rang his engines down to half speed and, slightly porting his helm, headed for some distance astern of the other. Then, starboarding, he swung round and bringing up parallel to her and some couple of 100 yards away, he dropped anchor. Without loss of a moment, a boat was lowered, and French, Cheyne, Price, the first officer, and a half-dozen men, all armed with service revolvers, tumbled in. Giving way lustily, they pulled for the Belgian. It was by this time possible to distinguish the features of the women, and French was not surprised to learn they were Joan Merrill and Susan Dangle. Evidently, they recognized Cheyne, who kept waving furiously as if he found the movement necessary to relieve his overwrought feelings. The 2 figures forward were those of men, and these stood watching the boat, though without exhibiting any of the transports of delight of their fellow shipmates on the bridge. As they drew closer, Joan made signs to them to go round to the other side of the ship, and dropping round her stern they saw a ladder rigged. In a few seconds they were alongside, and Cheyne, leaping out before the others, rushed up the steps and reached the deck. If there had been any doubts as to the real relations between himself and Joan, these were set at rest at that moment. Instinctively, he opened his arms, and Joan, swept off her feet by her emotion, threw herself into them and clung to him, while tears of joy and relief ran down her cheeks. As far as Cheyne was concerned, Susan Dangle, the figures on the forecastle, French, and the men behind him might as well not have existed. He crushed Joan violently to him, covering her face and hair with burning kisses, as he murmured brokenly of his love and of his thankfulness for her safety. French, anxious to learn the state of affairs and seeing nothing was to be got from Joan, turned expectantly to Susan Dangle. What could these unexpected developments mean? Was Susan, the enemy, now a friend? Where were the others? Were the ship's company friends or foes? Could he ask her questions which might incriminate her without giving her a formal warning? But his curiosity would brook no delay.
"I am Inspector French of Scotland Yard,"
he announced, while Price and the first officer stood round expectantly.
"You are Miss Susan Dangle. Where are the other members of this expedition?"
The girl wrung her hands, and he noticed how terribly pale and drawn was her face, and what horror shone in her eyes. "Oh," she cried, with a gesture as if to shut out the sight of some hideous dream. "Oh, it's been awful. I can't speak of it. They're dead. My brother James, Charles Syme, Mr. Merkel, most of the crew dead. All dead. Mr. Blessington wounded, probably dying. They got fighting over the gold." She began suddenly to laugh, a terrible, high cackling laugh that made her hearers shiver and attracted the attention even of Joan and Cheyne. French stepped quickly forward and seized her arm.
"There now, Miss Dangle,"
he said kindly but firmly.
"Stop that and pull yourself together. Your terrible experiences are over now, and you're in the hands of friends. But you mustn't give way like this. Make an effort and you'll be better directly."
He led her to a hatchway and made her sit down, while he continued soothing her as one would a fractious child. But so great was the agitation of both girls that it was quite a considerable time before the tragic tale of the Lescaut's expedition became fully unfolded. And when at last it was told, it proved still but one more illustration of the old truth that the qualities of greed and envy and selfishness have that seed of decay within themselves which leads their unhappy victims to overreach themselves, and instead of gaining what they seek, to lose their all. Shorn of incoherent phrases and irrelevant details, the story was this. On the 24th of May, the Lescaut had left Antwerp with 28 souls aboard. Aft, there were Joan, Susan, Blessington, Syme, Dangle, and Merkel, with the captain, first officer, and engineer, 9 persons, while forward there were 3 divers, 6 assistants, a cook, a steward, 4 seamen, and 4 engine room staff, or 19 altogether. Once clear of the Scheldt, Joan's treatment had changed. Her food was no longer drugged, and when in a few days she got over the effects of the doses she had received, she found her jailers polite and friendly, and anxious to minimize the inconvenience and anxiety she was suffering. They told her they did not wish her evil, and were taking her with them simply to prevent information as to themselves or their affairs leaking out through her. This, of course, she did not believe, since she did not possess sufficient information about them to enable her to interfere with their plans. But later, their real motive dawned on her. Gradually, she realized that Blessington had fallen in love with her, and though he was circumspect enough, her distrust of him was such that she felt sick with horror and dread when she thought of him. Nothing, however, had occurred to which she could take exception, and had it not been for her fears as to her own fate, and her anxieties as to Cheyne's, the voyage would have been pleasant enough. The Lescaut was a fast boat, and 4 days had brought them to the spot referred to in the cipher. After 3 days' search they found the wreck, and all 3 divers had at once gone down. A week was spent in making an examination of the vessel, at the end of which time they had located the gold. It was in her stern, low down and not far from her port side. The divers recommended blowing her plates off at this spot, and 10 days more sufficed for this. Through the hole thus made, the divers were able to draw in tackle lowered from the Lescaut, and the ingots of gold were slung to cradles and drawn up with really wonderful ease and speed. They had, moreover, been favored with a peculiarly fine stretch of weather, work having to be suspended on only 8 days of the 37 they were there. On reaching the wreck in the first instance, the captain had mustered his crew aft and had informed them, what he could no longer keep secret, that they were out for gold, and that if they found it in the quantities they hoped, every man on board would receive at the end of the trip a gift of £1,000 in addition to his pay. The men at first seemed more than satisfied, but as ingot after ingot was recovered, the generosity of the offer shrank in their estimation. 4 days before the appearance of French's party, the divers had reported that another day would complete the work, and then appeared the first hint that all was not well. On that last evening before the completion of the diving, the men came forward in a body and asked to see the captain. They explained that they had been reckoning up the value of the gold, and they weren't having £1,000 apiece. They wanted an even divide, all round. The captain argued with them, civilly enough at first, told them that they couldn't get the metal ashore and turned into money in secret, that the port officers or coast guards, wherever it was unloaded, would be bound to learn what they were doing, and that then the government would claim an enormous percentage of the whole, so that the £1,000 per man was an extremely liberal gift. The men declared that they would look after the unloading, and that they were going to have what they wanted. Hot words passed, and then the captain drew a revolver and said that he was captain there, and that what he said would go. Susan was watching the scene from the quarterdeck behind, but she could not be quite sure of what followed. One of the crew pressed forward, and the captain raised his revolver. She did not think he meant to fire, But another of the men either genuinely or purposely misunderstood his action. He raised his hand, a shot rang out, and the captain fell dead. The mutineers were evidently terribly upset by a murder which they had apparently never intended, and had Blessington and Syme acted intelligently, the trouble might have gone no further. But at that moment, these two worthies, who must have been in the chart-house all the time, began firing through the windows at the men. A regular pitched battle ensued, in which Syme and 5 of the crew were hit, 3 of the latter being killed. It was then war to the knife between those who berthed forward and those who berthed aft. All that night sporadic shots rang out at intervals, but at daybreak on the following day matters came to a head. The crew, with considerable generalship, made a feint on the forecastle with some of their number, while the remainder swarmed aft below decks. The defenders, taken in the rear, were shot down, and the mutineers were masters of the ship. All that next day, Joan and Susan, terror-stricken, clung to each other in the latter's cabin. The men were reasonably civil, told them they might get themselves food, and let them alone. But that night, a further terrible quarrel burst out between, as they learned afterwards, those who wished to murder the girls and go off with the treasure, and those who feared murder more than the loss of the gold. Once again there were the reports of shots and the groans of wounded men. The fusillade went on at intervals all night, until next morning one of the divers, a superior man with whom the girls had often talked, had come in with his head covered with blood, and asked the girls to bandage it. Susan had some slight surgical knowledge, and did what she could for him. Then the man told them that of the entire ship's company, only themselves and 7 others were alive, and that of these 7, 4 were so badly wounded that they would probably not recover. Among these was Blessington. Syme and James Dangle were dead. The slightly injured men threw the dead overboard and cleaned up the traces of the fighting, while the girls ministered to the seriously wounded. Of course, in the 3 days up till the arrival of the Avengers, who had by a strange trick of fate become the rescuers, 1 man had died. Of the 28 who sailed from Antwerp, there were therefore left only 9, the 2 girls and 4 slightly and 3 seriously wounded men. None of those able to move understood either engineering or seamanship, so that they had luckily decided to remain at anchor in the hope of some ship picking up their flag of distress. "There is just one thing I should like to understand," said Cheyne to Joan, when later on that day a prize crew had been put aboard the Lascaux and steam was being raised for the return to England. "And that is what happened to you on the night that we burgled Earlswood. You got back to your rooms, then left again with Syme and Blessington." "There's not much to tell about that," Joan answered, smiling happily up into her lover's eyes. "I was, as you know, standing like a watchman before the door of Earlswood, when I saw Susan and her brother coming up. I rang and knocked and kept them talking as long as possible. Then, when they opened the door, I slipped away. But I heard your footsteps and realized that you had got out by the back way. I heard you run off down the lane with Dangle after you. Then, remembering your arrangement about throwing away the tracing, I climbed over the wall, picked it up, and went back to my rooms. The first thing I did was to photograph it. Then I hid it in my color box. I had scarcely done so when Syme called. He said you had met with an accident, been caught between 2 motor cars and knocked down by one of them, and that you were seriously injured. He said you were conscious and had given him my address and were calling for me. I went down to find Blessington driving a car, though I didn't know then that it was Blessington. As soon as we started, Syme held a chloroform cloth over my mouth, and I don't remember much more till we were on the Lascaux." "But how did Syme find your rooms?" "Through Susan. Susan told me all about it afterwards. She went out after James and saw me climbing over the wall with the tracing. She followed me to my rooms and immediately telephoned to Syme. When Syme called, she was with him, and while I changed my coat, Syme led her into the studio, and she hid behind an easel until we were gone. She searched till she found the tracing and then simply walked out. The gang had intended to go to Antwerp the following week in any case, but this business upset their plans and they decided to start immediately. Dangle went on and arranged for the Lescaut to leave some days earlier. The rest of us put up at Ghent till she was ready to sail. But little further remains to be told. The few bars of gold still left on the Silurian were soon raised, and the 2 ships set sail, reaching Chatham some 5 days later. All the bullion theoretically belonged to the Crown, but under the special circumstances, a generous division was made whereby 25% was returned to the finders. As Price refused to accept the whole amount, an amicable agreement was come to, whereby Cheyne, Joan, and Price each received almost 1/3, or £200,000 apiece. Of the balance of over £20,000, £10,000 was given to Susan Dangle by Joan's imperative directions. She said that Susan was not a bad girl, and had turned up trumps during the trouble on the Lescaut. £1,000 went to Inspector French, also Joan's gift, and the remainder was divided among the officers and men of the Admiralty salvage boat. A few days after landing, Maxwell Cheyne and Joan Merrill had occasion to pay a short visit to the Church of St. Margaret's in the Fields, after which Cheyne whirled his wife away to Devonshire, so that she might make the acquaintance of his family and see the country where began that strange series of events, which in the beginning of the story I alluded to as the Cheyne Mystery. End of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts.